perspective, we're starting to see what we would characterize as kind of a new world order forming, specifically around the raft of federal bills that have been flowing. Uh, Decided that it was time to try to make some sense of what that looked like. We've been working with a handful of folks who really see pieces of these bills as total game changers. Manufacturers who believe American manufacturing might actually be able to compete with Taiwan and China. And luckily, we've been able to connect with Bruce Katz and a great team out of Drexel, who've been looking at how other cities and states are starting to think about orienting behind what is a rather chaotic set of circumstances. So we do think that the amount of resource flow could be dramatic and considerable. We think the ability to impact the kind of folks we all care about squarely on the table. There's still some hurdles to get over, and I think Bruce and his team are ready to walk us through that. So with that, a big hearty welcome. Grab a cup of coffee. We got a wild ride ahead of us. Bruce's presentation, meaty presentation, gonna get through that. His team is going to be monitoring the chat and the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. So welcome any of those, that kind of discussion, and we'll get this video posted on the Heinz YouTube channel in case anybody wants to share it or come back to it for any reason. With that, I'm gonna mute my mic and toss this thing over to you, Bruce.
Well, thanks, Rob, and thanks to you and Andrew for really putting this together. And it's wonderful to be with a set of stakeholders from Pittsburgh, one of my favorite cities, not just in the U.S. but the world. Florian, I think, is going to post the presentation, and then we can start the ride. And so the focus of this is really how you master the moment. And to build on what Rob has said, it is chaotic, it is uncertain. There's an enormous amount of federal funding and state funding that's moving. And so if there's any place I think that can be the vanguard of a new kind of economy shaping and talent preparing and placemaking, it's Pittsburgh. So let's go to the next slide. I'm Bruce Katz. I run a Metro Finance lab at Drexel. I also founded New Localism Associates. I'm going to ask my colleagues just to quickly introduce themselves. So Lori. Oh, you're on mute.
I'm Lori Bamberger, not muted anymore, and I'm the managing director of ABK City Advisors, which is an inclusive economic development firm, in addition to working with Bruce and the Drexel team. Excited to be here today.
And Brian.
Hi, everyone. My name is Brian. I'm a graduate student in history at the University of Oxford, and I work for the NOAC Metro Finance Lab as a graduate research analyst. Wonderful to be here with you all today.
And Florian.
Hi, everyone. My name is Florian Chalio, a project director, and I work at New Localism Associates, where I work closely with Bruce.
So let's show you what we've come up with, because we've been doing this with some of the initial federal investments in state funding, but with the passage of the CHIPS Act, and particularly the Inflation Reduction Act, we've really rounded this out. So next slide. And what we're going to do is take you through sort of a linear presentation, which focuses first and foremost on market dynamics in the US and globally, which we think is going to fundamentally restructure urban and metropolitan economies in some profound ways, and opens up some challenges but real opportunities. Then we're going to go through, Florian's going to take us through an overview of federal funding flows, some of what's happening at the state level. Lori's going to take us through the Inflation Reduction Act, which may seem painful at times, but I think we really do need to wrap around our heads around what is essentially a flow of tax advantage capital. For those on the phone who've dealt with LIHTC and historic preservation tax credits and new market tax credits or opportunity zones, this is your time to shine. Then I'm going to walk through some early signals from around the country and end up with some final thoughts for Pittsburgh. Brian's going to be monitoring the chat and questions. So if you have questions, just throw them in or put them in the chat, and Brian will sort out how to respond to them in some kind of thematic and logical order. So let me start with the first bit. There was a great, next slide, there was a great piece in the New York Times, probably in March of 2022 by Gianna Smialek, who I think is really one of the top economic observers in the US right now. And she basically said the way to think about the world is it's almost like a snow globe. You shake it up and, you know, all the flakes are moving all over the place and nothing has really settled. And, you know, almost a year later, I think we're still in the same situation. We're still seeing the outcome of the pandemic, you know, remote work, supply chains, unprecedented federal spending, the inflation effect, the Ukraine and geopolitical tensions, which frankly may be the biggest thing that's happened with a long tail effect, whether it's on reshoring or remilitarization. We'll talk about that. Housing affordability, climate, the racial justice imperative, the looming recession. I mean, this is a complicated period. And if folks on the phone are feeling unnerved, you should be. I don't think we've ever experienced anything like this. And it's not going to end soon, because when the federal money sort of ends, we may find ourselves with a major fiscal headache in cities and counties. So that's the bigger picture. Next slide. There are clearly a set of knowns, right, in terms of what's coming from the bipartisan infrastructure bill, the new divided government in Washington, what that means, sort of reality TV on a daily basis, this incredible industrial transformation with electrification of the auto sector, some very challenging issues around parasitic capital, investor capital moving into the housing market, and the structural nature of remote work. Those are knowns. There's a whole bunch of stuff that is not totally understood yet. And I'd start with our relationships with Russia and China, because that has enormous effects on national security and has enormous effects on technology and production issues, and really sort of drove the Chips and Science Act and the notion that we really need to control in the United States natural resources around critical industries. So there's a whole bunch of other unknowns, but again, we're not through this new disorder. I think a lot of folks love to talk about a new normal because that makes it sound like things have settled. They haven't settled yet. Next slide. So the question is, who's going to be able to sort of navigate through this period? The national government and the state governments are governments, and they are trying as best as they can in most parts of the country to provide guidance and to provide capital. But at the end of the day, cities and metros, not just governments, but private and philanthropic and university and labor and other leaders are really the ones who have to design and deliver, even if it's a great portion of the financing is coming from federal and state coffers. So next slide, we're just going to build this. Why do cities and metros are in a sort of interesting leadership position? This was the whole thesis of the New Localism book. It's because they are able to take these vertical federal and state investments that are very compartmentalized, very balkanized, very fragmented, and align and layer them, particularly in specific geographies, whether it's downtowns, whether it's waterfronts, whether it's airports, et cetera. Next bit. There also is, the reality that cities and metros are the engines of national and state economies. So they're starting with a level of power and distinctive advantages that they can leverage. And then next part, they do have the ability for network effects. And in any given place given, either the challenge or the opportunity. It is critical to really get this coalition building across sectors and across jurisdictions, because then you're able to sort of put together solutions that really have sustained effect and have maximum impact. So there's a lot of focus now on top-down leadership, federal government, state government, and again, they are providing unprecedented levels of investment. But at the end of the day, whether Pittsburgh or Philly or Cleveland or Detroit or any of these places are able to rebound is essentially about local leadership. And I think so much of this call and webinar is going to be about how to organize for success. And next slide. So when you think about these major sort of trends and dynamics, there is a lot at stake for American cities and metropolitan areas. Next slide. Just think about sort of a base case around reshoring or electrification or federal funding or the pandemic or the racial imperative. If we do nothing intentional or purposeful, I think a whole bunch of places are going to get bypassed. They're not going to realize their full potential. And even worse, some of the most dramatic effects of the pandemic, the collapse of downtowns and all the reverberating effects of that, some of the parasitic and predatory capital that it's made its way, it's just going to exacerbate the situation. But next slide. If we are able to get our act together, so to speak, and particularly places like Pittsburgh, that I think has had, a new localism. It was like a whole chapter on Pittsburgh, 40-year-old overnight success story, right? There is the ability to take these very complex dynamics, armed with new federal and state investments, leveraging up private and philanthropic capital, and really build a platform for an innovative and inclusive and sustainable economy going forward. So not every place in the US is going to be able to do that. I mean, that's part of the challenge with our society, is that we accept the level of unevenness and spatial disparity. But these are dynamics that can be harnessed for major impact, particularly for people in places that have been left behind. So that's sort of the overview. And I think, it's important to start there, because I think a good portion of the federal focus has been on their own investments. But investments are, only matter, A, if they can be harnessed, and B, if they can leverage these broader economic and market and social dynamics. And that's what we're trying to interweave. I'm going to turn over to Florian, who's going to take us through some of the existing federal funds.
Thanks, Bruce. So as Bruce mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, we're going to spend quite a bit of time talking about the Inflation Reduction Act and what it means for metros like Pittsburgh and also across the country. But the Inflation Reduction Act is really sort of the most recent act in a play that has been unfolding for the last several years. The Biden administration, and even at the end of the Trump administration, released several major economic bills that have often been compared to the New Deal in some way, in terms of the size and the potential effect of those investments across the country. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about the previous acts of that play, so to speak. And, I know that, Kierkegaard said that life must be lived forward, but it can only be understood backward. And I think that's particularly prescient in a time like this, because so much of what's happening is unfolding very quickly, and the funding that is being released is the outcome of the political reality of the moment. And so it's not as if there's a master plan that is being legislated through these bills, but rather just a series of packages and a series of intent that's being passed down to metros and localities across the country that we now need to deal with. So the three major pieces of legislation that have already started to unfold that we can understand a little bit looking backwards. Are the CARES Act, which is about $1.9 trillion at the end of the Trump administration, then the American Rescue Plan right at the beginning of the Biden administration, and finally the bipartisan infrastructure law, which was about $1.2 trillion. And so, all of these together, are close to, over $5 trillion in funding, but they have quite a few differences that I think are really important. And when we're able to look backwards, we can pull a couple of interesting trends and sort of hints as to how to best use and leverage some of this money for the best effect in metros. So the CARES Act was, if you remember, it was largely a bill that flowed where most of the money flowed directly to individuals and businesses. And this was really an outcome of the fact that it was unfolding right at the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic. And there was an immediate need by individuals and businesses for cash and for liquidity. When the American Rescue Plan was passed, then at the beginning of the Biden administration, there were additional payments that were made to individuals and businesses, but there was also a very large chunk of money that went to state, local, and tribal governments and school districts as well. And the shift here, looking backwards, is really one to start thinking about, now that the most immediate needs have been fulfilled for individuals and businesses, what are the other things that the federal government must do to sort of backfill problems that had arisen through the pandemic? And so that was a big reason that so much of the money went into the coffers of state, local, and tribal governments. Now, you'll remember that this is flexible. A lot of this is flexible money, which differs quite a bit from with some of the legislation down the line. We then moved to the bipartisan infrastructure law, which, if I could sum it up in just a couple of words, one word, it would really just be chaos. This piece of legislation was really a flow of money to a slew of different local, public and local actors, whether that be state, local, and tribal governments, public authorities, universities, nonprofits, metropolitan planning organizations, and everything in between. It's a complete maze of different pockets of largely competitive grant opportunities that has been quite difficult for medium and small size metros to follow. One quick plug that I'll make is that at Drexel, we have created a tracker specifically for the infrastructure bill that gives you updates every time a new funding opportunity is posted, and that way you can make sure that your city, your region stays on top of all the different funding opportunities that the federal government is putting out. We'll certainly follow up with a link to this as well, but the QR code is there if you want to sign up. And so, what I would say as I close with these past funding bills is that it really has been a shift from filling the most immediate needs for individuals and businesses to then thinking about, okay, what are some of the other needs that we need to backfill in state and local government? And now thinking more about what are the longer term needs that this country needs in terms of investments in infrastructure. And as you'll hear shortly, in things like climate, American manufacturing, and so forth. And so you can see this sort of gradual shift from the short to the long term in funding opportunities as they arise. There's one piece of one ripple to this, which is that the federal government is not the only actor that's putting a lot of money into the mix. State governments across the country are acting quite boldly to in many ways supplement some of the funding that has come through the federal government. And you can see this in places like California, Connecticut, or Indiana that are putting hundreds of millions of dollars up for regional economic development funds that are in some ways modeled after the Department of Commerce's Build Back Better Regional Challenge. Or you have states that are pushing very aggressively with very strong subsidies for semiconductor manufacturers. There's, of course, the Intel story in Ohio and the Micron story in New York. And then you also have states that are investing very heavily to try to capture some of the new industries that they think are poised for growth, whether it's in innovation or the electric vehicle industry, or others. So these are some of the dynamics, I think, that really set the stage for the Inflation Reduction Act, which is, as Lori will explain, a whole thing of its own, I might say. And so with that, I'll pass it on to Lori.
Thanks, Florian. Oh. All right. Why don't we go to the, well, I guess the next step. Yeah, the next slide. So I think I get to start with, as opposed to looking back to the future, where most of the regulations haven't even been written yet. So we can try to guess and take a stab at what the few facts are that we know. IRA is a $411 billion climate transition industrial policy bill. It's still about infrastructure, but it's about the infrastructure necessary to clean our economy, our homes, our workplaces, our manufacturing inputs and outputs, our neighborhoods, cars, and power. The biggest difference from the bipartisan infrastructure law are twofold. First, beneficiary. As Florian mentioned, the beneficiaries of BIL were governments primarily, deployed through grants and formula funding. Here, if you look on the right colorful pie chart, and by the way, this was prepared by the climate mayors in C40, so we are very grateful for these amazing colorful pie charts. Fully 55%, 227 billion of these funds go to businesses and 11% to individuals, kind of back to the CARES mode, which are focusing on individuals and businesses. Although in this case, these are tax credits and some other tax incentives. Only 9% toward the top in the green is the combination of local, state, and tribal governments, with about $37 billion. The second big distinction from bipartisan infrastructure law is the sector. This is truly about energy and about the transition from the energy we have today to clean energy, renewable energy, and energy efficiency and air pollution reduction, in part through electrification. The next slide. So this slide shows where we're going to go into our deep dive and how we decided on the discussion today in this deep dive. Despite most of the press and the gray circles on the left about some of the smaller pieces of this legislation, although they're still quite important, and we'll talk a little bit about them at the end. The largest sectors and portions to talk about first, of course, are the production of renewable energy, not just utility scale, but what individuals in their homes and businesses can do to produce their own energy. The second two are tied with about 12% each and 48 billion, the clean manufacturing incentives and the incentives for all sorts of building owners, whether individuals or commercial or industrial. And then finally, we get to that 37 billion slice of the pie, the 9%, that are grants that go to all sorts of governments. It includes grants to states, grants to cities, grants to counties, and also grants to nonprofit organizations. Next slide. This is I get as the third person to go today, the complicated tax credits. So I'm going to try to simplify them. I may make you more confused. I hope not. I'm going to disclaim myself. I'm a policy attorney, not a tax advisor, but as a good attorney, disclaiming. But so this is really the key to the structure of the vast majority of those business and individual tax credits. The largest part of funding, 127 billion, is set up to incentivize the growth and transition to clean power. It does this with a juiced tax credit, the investment tax credit, ITC, the production tax credit, PTC, that are already existing and part of a sophisticated tax equity financing arena many of you are very familiar in. or very familiar in LIHTC, which is a similar kind of tax equity financing system. Here, renewable project developers, not real estate developers necessarily, with tax credit hungry companies finance and build renewable systems, generating power for building owners, industrial complexes, school and governments, and some at scale utilities so that we can power our lives. Today, the ITC is primarily solar, PTC is primarily wind. What the IRA does is, first of all, extend the credit for 10 years. Then it adopts technological neutrality so that you can use it not only for solar or for wind, but also for energy storage, geothermal, clean hydrogen, and nuclear. It offers, most importantly, for let's say the hospitals and universities that are in Pittsburgh and other nonprofits and government agencies, a direct pay option where not tax exempt entities can be paid the value of the credit as opposed to having to identify a third party to transfer the value of the credit in a sophisticated financial transaction. And then most important, in my opinion, besides direct pay, is that the IRA boosts the credit today at 6% up to nearly 70% if the project, the energy project, can achieve specific inclusive economic development goals. And I'm going to talk about those goals as boosts on the next slide. So this slide comes from Novogradac. Many of you are probably familiar with their tax advisory services. This is not a plug for them, but probably a deep plug for me again. This is the set of boosts or adders to bring the tax credit from a 6% value to a 70% value. And first, you start at the bottom of the slide where it says 6%. You get from 6 to 30, a 5-fold jump in the value of the credit by paying prevailing wages and hiring from 10 to 15% of your labor from eligible apprenticeship programs that are still being described by the IRS today. You can get to 40% by buying American, 50% by locating this project in a low-income community, a census tract, 60% by locating in what's defined as an energy community, which is a legacy fossil fuel or coal community, or a brownfield. And you can get to 70% by not only being in a low-income census tract, but also working with making sure the benefits flow to a federally subsidized affordable housing development. To me, the adders are a different way to think about subsidized economic development. The prevailing wage adder in particular, which increases the credit 5-fold, means that cities, trades, WMBEs, and higher education will need to partner to develop eligible credentials and workforce training that helps these project developers quickly meet their hiring needs by coming to your own city, to Pittsburgh. In addition, to the extent you can, you would identify places that are low-income census tracts, brownfields, or energy communities, again, to attract solar project developers or energy storage today, or geothermal to your community. Next slide. This is about one of the 12% circles that we talked about. This is clean manufacturing, and it is about $48 billion in incentives. And they follow the same structure, the first two anyway, of the ITC and PTC, the general ones that I just mentioned before. Namely, they have nearly the same adders for the manufacture of components used in renewable energy, including, in renewable industries, including solar, wind, and now batteries, EVs, and mineral processing. There's also a few funding sources, not necessarily tax credits, but grants and loans to convert existing non-renewable manufacturing to EVs. and also notably a $6 billion new source to reduce emissions in existing high energy intensity industries like cement, steel, and aluminum. Next slide. So the building sector is another of the 12% benefit of the IRA. It's another 48 billion. It's a lot more complicated in my opinion, because there are just such an enormous diversity of beneficiaries that are owners of buildings, ranging from homeowners to apartment owners to large-scale landowners and commercial owners. And this category is also all the tax-exempt owners like universities, hospitals, cities, governments. So switching gears, this slide is first and foremost, if you look at the second row, this is the same clean energy ITC that existed before. It's just designated in particular for commercial and multifamily building owners, with still the 30 to 70% adders for direct pay, for prevailing wage, for low-income communities and energy communities, and buying American. Each category of owners is offered two different kinds of incentives, either first for renewability, renewable generation akin to the ITC, or for efficiency and electrification. In terms of going through some of the specifics here, one of the notable changes that IRR makes for commercial building owners, which this is a tax deduction, not a credit, but this would pertain again to the tax exempt organizations, is that the threshold to take advantage of this credit has been reduced. Instead of having to meet 50% of energy savings, you only have to meet 25% of energy savings. And the rebate value is quintupled if you do hit the higher savings and if you do use the prevailing wage and apprenticeship bonus, up to about $5 per square foot. Moving down, both commercial and multifamily owners can use the ITC for the up to 70% credit and the direct pay. Homeowners have their own tax credit, as they have had for solar, but it also extends to battery storage and geothermal. HUD offers a grant program, their green retrofit program that they've had, with a new $1 billion appropriation for energy and water efficiency. And the bottom line here on buildings is that the success of home and building upgrades and renewables will depend in a huge part on getting the word out about rebates and tax credits, and the capacity to use rebates and tax credits and tax forms. I skipped down to the next slide. One last thing is there is a credit available that is made much more robust in IRA, not only for new Energy Star homes that are single family, but for zero energy ready multifamily homes with up to 5,000 per unit credit. And if you think about that in terms of, let's say, a 100-unit building, we're getting up to the $500,000 credit level. Can you go to the next slide? The other mechanism by which building owners are subsidized through the IRA is through rebates. It makes sense if you think about it. Tax credits are typically used by businesses and wealthier individuals because you have to have enough income to have enough need for tax credits. And you also have to have enough disposable income to pay for the 70% of the renewable installation that the individual is still having to pay for. In a prior life, I worked on on-bill financing and pays and other ways to cover the piece that individuals are still stuck with. Today, we're sticking just to the credits. That's where rebates come in. Nicely, Pennsylvania has the 6th highest allocation of rebates from IRA, 259 million. However, these rebates come into the state. They have up to 2 years to develop a plan of how they're going to distribute the rebates to point of sale retail stores, probably, and contractors. This is where cities and jurisdictions and contractors need to come in to make sure these rebates come in fast and easily. Notably, the rebates are targeted for both homeowners and low and moderate income homeowners and the multifamily owners of low and moderate income housing and multifamily housing. In particular, families up to 150% of area median income are able to get a 50 to 100% cost reduction on high efficiency electric appliances. And they go up to $14,000 is what these families are eligible for. Separately, where am I? I'm going to go to the next slide. This shows what we mean by home energy efficiency and electrification. These are the specific appliance purchases that are made more accessible through a 50 to 100% rebate for low and moderate income families, or for a tax credit for energy efficiency for families regardless of income. But if you go to the right side of the slide, we are not really talking about it so much today, but a huge portion of the IRA goes to subsidizing through rebates, new EVs and used EVs. New EVs are at $7,500, but clearly you have to have the income to support the rest of the cost of that EV. Used EVs max out at $1,000. I wonder whether that'll be enough to make a new used EV industry accessible, especially by families at the moderate and lower end of things. And next slide. So this is the slide that most cities and presentations are focused on, which are what are the grants that come into cities and potentially nonprofits. This is a 37 billion slice of the pie. What I'm showing on this slide are 6 kinds of grant programs that are available to cities and in some cases to community-based organizations. These are going to be highly different: air pollution reduction, neighborhood equity and access, which is actually a continuation of the bipartisan infrastructure bill's Reconnecting Communities program. That program had $1 billion. This is a new $3 billion added to it. There's an urban community and forestry program and an environmental justice block grant. These are going to be highly competitive funds for cities and nonprofits. Some of them require nonprofits to be the lead, like the urban forestry and environmental climate justice block grant. And notably, 4 of the 5 of these are part of the Biden administration's Justice 40 initiative, which ensures or hopes, or somewhere in the middle there, that 40% of the benefits are going to go to disadvantaged communities. And therefore, they'll have implementation assistance, but also enormous planning and collaboration requirements in order to apply for and access those grants. I'm going to, I saw one of the questions on rural. I know I focused on most of the urban parts of these grants. There are significant grants for rural areas as well. We just didn't identify them here. And now I'm going to turn it back to Bruce.
So next slide, what I'm going to ask Laurie to do, there's some really specific, detailed questions, and Laurie can answer those in writing. And then there's some much broader structural issues that are being raised here about the interplay of states and sub-state actors like cities, counties, utilities, and beyond. And we should probably open that up after we're done. But let me start talking about early signals from across the country based on some of the prior federal funds. So next slide. First of all, everyone should take a breath, right? Because we are really going through a remarkable transformation, both on an economic side and on a federal and state investment side. We've gone from scarcity to abundance in a pretty rapid pace here. So as we're thinking about organizing for success, perfect is the enemy of the good. I think there's not going to be a test tomorrow on what's in the IRA or what's in the BIL or whatever. But I think for leaders, for stakeholders from different sectors, it really is important to focus on the North Star around restructuring of economy for inclusive and sustainable effects. You can divide and conquer. You got a lot of stakeholders in a place like Pittsburgh, at the city and the county and the regional level, who have expertise. And as we go forward with this, you could see how there could be different project leads or program leads or thematic leads. This is a moment to do the math. So I do think that for a good portion, because of the scarcity of investments, there hasn't been a project focus in many cities and counties at the level it needs to be. There's going to be capital stacking here between government investments, whether they're block grants, competitive grants, low cost finance, or tax incentives, with debt, with equity, with concessionary capital, with local tax. So we have to think all that through. The math really matters here. And then as you begin to organize and begin to set tables around all this, meet to decide, not to discuss. I mean, a lot of cities and counties have become great deliberative societies, but nothing ever gets done. This is a time for action. So as we go through these early signals, I think you'll get a sense of what other places are beginning to do. Next slide. What we're going to focus on, and then we're going to sort of adapt it to IRA and the climate moment, are 7 strategies that are basically being designed and delivered in different parts of our country. And this is not the sum total, but these are, I think, very illustrative examples about places that are seizing the moment for purposeful effect. We're going to talk about the use of investment playbooks in Buffalo, which is really, putting projects together for some cumulative impact. We're going to talk about industrial policy. A lot of this is coming out of the federal level, but a lot of it's coming out of the states, as Florian has said, centers of excellence related to manufacturing and other innovation sectors. Placemaking, using the infrastructure investments to, basically reposition critical parts of our cities and counties for the next generation of growth. Talent, procurement, supply chain finance, so that we get new financial products that enable particularly more Black and brown businesses to participate. And then nerve center ideas of trying to organize this across these multiple dimensions. So what different cities are doing, this is classic American experimentation, right? We are not a society where we basically have top-down dictation of what to do. We have federal and state direction and federal state investments, and then different parts of the country stand up and say, 1 from column A, 2 from column B, 3 from column C, here's how we're going to take advantage of these different investments. So as I go through this, think about Pittsburgh and how these early signals from US cities might be applied. Next slide. So I'm going to walk through these really 7. The first is Buffalo. And it gets back to this sort of challenge of do the math. In Buffalo, east side of Buffalo, historic African-American community, very distressed, very disadvantaged, had received funding from New York State over the past decade for rejuvenation around commercial corridors, small business, and workforce. They then basically created an investment playbook, very clear, specific, concrete project on the east side of Buffalo that they were able to then go to the state and the Ralph Wilson Foundation and leverage up hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars, including the renovation of an old Amtrak transit station, renovation of an historic food hall, African-American Heritage Center, investment playbooks that combine separate but related projects are fit the moment. And we'll talk about how this might apply in the climate side. Next slide. Industrial policy. This is a moment for universities and industry to come together around applied research and technological product and process improvement. St. Louis is doing this, led by Boeing, around advanced manufacturing, particularly in the aerospace side. You already have this in Pittsburgh with Carnegie Mellon and Pitt. The question is whether there are new centers of excellence or bulked up centers of excellence that could be funded perhaps with state money in addition to federal money. So industrial policy has made its way into the US. It relates to the platform that universities have and their relationship to industry. Next slide. Placemaking. A lot of the infrastructure in our old industrial cities is literally 19th century, early 20th century. So if you go into the waterfront areas, particularly, or the downtown areas of our cities, you've got road, transit, water, sewer, stormwater, digital, energy, all of which is legacy. In some cities like Cleveland, because of master developers, they are looking at making sizable investments to reconfigure infrastructure for the next generation of growth. This is infrastructure with a purpose. This is infrastructure that's not compartmentalized by federal programs, that is pulled together for maximum impact. Cleveland and Detroit in particular are probably further ahead on this because of the ownership of the Dan Gilbert companies, Bedrock Detroit, et cetera. This could also have implications for Pittsburgh. Next slide. Talent, workforce. We're at a moment of economic restructuring where we need skilled workers for a burst in manufacturing, skilled workers for a burst in climate-oriented investments, and skilled workers to basically replace workers who have left the healthcare sector, nursing and other technicians. In Flint, Michigan, they are considering a Flint Initiative talent that connects the community college, four-year public university, Flint, Kettering University, Co-op Engineering School, working closely with their business community, both to attract manufacturers, work with the hospitals, fill in the missing demand that we have, or the missing sort of workforce needs with new credentialed or certificate driven workers. So talent with some early signals. Next slide. Procurement. We are going to basically, government or public authorities or nonprofit entities are going to buy a whole bunch of goods and services. The question is, do they buy them just from large firms, or do they buy them from a broader mix of small and medium-sized enterprise and large vendors? And how we use this procurement moment to basically grow the size and the scale of particularly Black and Brown-owned business. San Antonio, about 65% Latino population, is looking across all their public authorities around diverse spending and beginning to create initiatives with their business chamber, with their universities, with their entrepreneurial support organizations, and with their CDFIs to focus on the procurement moment. Again, clear signals for Pittsburgh. Next slide. Finance, products, particularly around procurement and particularly around the growth of Black and Latino firms. We have antiquated financial products in the United States. They are too debt-oriented, coming from the banks and the CDFIs. And when we talk about venture, venture rarely gets to minority-owned enterprises. So what is happening right now in a variety of states is, with federal funding, the State Small Business Credit Initiative, new kinds of financial products are being invented. New York State's taking the lead on supply chain finance. Washington State is taking the lead on revenue-based financing. This could also help us ensure that this economic transition has inclusive outcomes. Next slide. So these are all separate, right, strategies and initiatives. The question is how you organize this. And in certain parts of the country, what you're beginning to see are public, private, and civic entities coming together and creating a table, not a very large table, but a table where these leaders and institutions can sit together, begin to implement projects that have been identified that have some transformative effect, particularly around particular geographies. In Erie, Pennsylvania, it was the greater downtown, and then get to implementation and execution. So this is a different way of organizing that is beginning to be experimented with in parts of the country, particularly those parts that have investment playbooks. So early signals about not just what kind of projects to invest in, but how to invest in them to have big effects. And all this is pre-IRA, Inflation Reduction Act, and all of this is pre-CHIPS and Science Act. So these are early signals from the CARES Act, from the infrastructure bill, and from the American Rescue Plan. Next slide. So all this now has to be updated to include the impact of the Inflation Reduction Act in particular and its effect on climate. So you could, and this is really the bottom part of this slide, you could take each of these different kinds of strategies and put a climate twist on them, put an IRA twist on them, right? You could have clean economy investment playbooks, climate investment playbooks. You could align state and local policy on the industrial side to be more climate friendly. And a lot of the information or questions in the chat go directly to that. You could also create new centers of excellence, and we can talk about that around the climate option. Do the same on placemaking, talent for sure, because of the need for a new generation of skilled workers, procurement, finance, because there's going to be a need not just for supply chain financial products, there's going to be a need for concierge services to understand even the capital stacking of a lot of this. And then finally, one unified effort, let's say a climate action team, to pull all this together across sectors, perhaps across jurisdictions. So these early signals, which happened when frankly no one thought a climate bill would pass because of all the machinations in Congress, you can take these early signals, you can adapt them to the IRA and adapt them to a sort of essentially what is the emergence of a new climate economy in the US. Next slide. So what does this all mean for Pittsburgh? And then we're going to end and then go to a bit of back and forth in the questions. Next slide. And this really does get to the question of how, and going back to what Florian said about how these different federal investment bills have been organized. The Inflation Reduction Act is a different animal, a completely different animal than the infrastructure bill, the American Rescue Plan, and even the CHIPS and Science bill. And the way to think about organizing this is to think right in the middle of this concentric circle. Who's benefiting from this? Who are the users, right? Who are going to basically get the tax incentives? Then around them are folks who clearly can organize all this, communicate, because as some of the folks wrote in the questions, a lot of homeowners, consumers are not aware of these benefits. So this is a little almost like the earned income tax credit, where we need communication and marketing campaigns and other kinds of organizers like the utilities to help a broader set of actors just understand from the get-go what's available. And then there are, in the latter circle, specialists, folks who can advise on project finance, folks who can advise on the tax, and folks who can enable growth of businesses in the next generation sectors, as well as the growth of skilled workers. This is essentially tailor-made for cities and metropolitan areas, because again, cities and metropolitan areas are not governments, they really are networks. And so we can think about a new organizing regime. I think we can really have the full impact of these extraordinary federal and state investments. Next slide. Pittsburgh has some enormous advantages here. And the question for everyone on this chat is, can you be the vanguard of essentially this clean economy transition. You do have, particularly on the innovation side, because of Pitt and CMU and others, a deep sort of expertise in technology breakthroughs that are going to apply to the clean economy. They may not be the first wave of technology products that people think about, but robotics, automation, advanced, artificial intelligence, all this applies. Healthcare is, and the eds and meds in particular, as Laurie said, are deeply affected by all this if they take advantage of this. And on the fossil fuel side, you do have sort of a starting point which requires you to be even considered to be an energy community that has to transition, right? So there's like a starting point here that we could basically say it's not going to be ubiquitous. Not every place looks like Pittsburgh, but there are certain aspects of your industrial, economic, and energy position, and eds and meds position, which basically situate you well. On the other side, however, your downtown's been hit hard by this pandemic, very hard, like many others. That's going to require sort of a level of focus because of the revenue effects of that and the small business effects of that. And your state really has not played a serious role for many, for a long period of time. There was a point in time when Pennsylvania led economic development in the US going back 30 or 40 years. That ain't the case anymore. And so if the state has to basically step up right now, because other states that surround you and in other parts of the country, as Rob said in the chat, they are eating your lunch. So understanding your position and both on the sort of strength side and the liability side is necessary. Next slide. And this is where we're going to end up. There does seem to be a moment here where Pittsburgh and a network of stakeholders coming together could basically be one of the few places that can act across all these multiple dimensions. You have an exceptional group of practitioners. You really do have a remarkable platform. You could, going to the bottom part of this slide, be the first on the block, so to speak, to create an investment playbook that focuses on the climate transition across multiple sectors. You could focus on centers of excellence. You could have a focus on geographies that are either that are dramatically threatened, by structural changes in our economy. You can use all this to grow a much broader, diverse set of workers and businesses. You could create a concierge service so folks can understand how to stack the capital. And you could put together a unified climate action team to pull across sectors, disciplines, and jurisdictions. So most parts of this country, to tell you the truth, and this is really a challenge for us, are not going to be capable of acting with intentionality and purpose around all these federal and state investments. The money's going to come, it's going to go, and for a good portion of the country, they're going to wonder a decade from now, what the hell is that all about? So I think for Pittsburgh and a small number of places that in the past have shown the ability to organize for success, this could be a remarkable moment. But it won't just happen, and the feds in the states are not going to put the thumb on the scale, so to speak, and say, we're putting all our eggs into the Pittsburgh basket. They're just creating essentially a platform for folks either to seize or to basically ignore or dismiss or have bits of it basically carried out. So Rob, with that, we're going to go back. I'm going to go now into the Q&A.
Can I offer just a couple of reflections, Bruce, while you're maybe get your thoughts line around that? As you're working through some of these national models, what kind of jumps into my head is that we've got the seeds of some really good stuff brewing by really exceptional folks. I do think we're caught a little bit in several decades of resource constrainment. So
Yeah,
this notion of kind of, I'm thinking Build Back Better. We just landed a great EDA grant, and there's a great collaborative of folks doing pretty incredible work on that front around bringing technology into our existing manufacturing pieces. Good stuff on the supply chain. Scaling that is going to be our issue. Obviously, we've been at the riverfront placemaking for a while. We're not done with that work, and other kind of smart placemaking. So we have the seeds of stuff. The question is, can we be optimistic around scaling that during a time of this continued uncertainty? And having the fate of a lot of this stuff rest at the IRS and the Treasury is super unnerving. So that's one thought. The other thought I had is how well positioned southwestern Pennsylvania is politically to land just about anything we might want to land, specifically before the next federal election. And so huge opportunity for us, like in the national politic. A lot of comments around rural competitiveness writ large, um, and about our ability to absorb that capital, the capacity of outlying municipalities who might have great sites but don't yet have the developer, or don't yet have the user, or aren't marketing and trying to land alternative energy, doing that because our state isn't well positioned to compete, right? Like
yeah,
I'm really unnerved. We have lost our manufacturing muscle memory. We just lost it. And I'm going to guess there's been about 100,000 jobs of clean manufacturing that the earlier bills have spearheaded,
that's right.
and we haven't landed many, if one of them. But Ohio and New York have been at it for 25 years, and they're ready, and we're not. So that is, as I think about where rural places might actually start to compete, how the innovations happening out of the innovation might be able to keep and grow and make manufacturing more competitive. We have some capacity issues, and we've lost our ability. I think the new administration at the state understands and sees it. They've got good people in place, but we're playing a lot of catch up there. So those are just kind of big reflections. I totally appreciate you and your team with very little time. Um, at least putting the ingredients of all the sausage on the table. I think we said up front that this was going to be more frustrating than settling, but I think to a certain extent we need to be shaken up a little bit. So again, thanks you and your team. I just wanted to give you a chance to try to digest some of these questions.
No, that's really helpful. And these questions, by the way, are phenomenal, and
Yeah.
they go from the general to the specific, and I think they're emblematic of this moment, right? So Brian is just going to start figuring out how to organize this in some intelligent way, but that's why he's at the University of Oxford, to tell you the truth.
I will argue that the one industry cluster that appears to work and function in our state is the fossil fuel industry cluster. It is the smallest jobs generator of all of our employment clusters. And it'd be interesting to hear more from you, Bruce, why you think that's a strength in a climate pivot, at some point. Because I think there's a lot of people on the phone we've just gotten out of a decade of believing that maybe there's a there, only to have many of our counties with less jobs, no attention on healthcare, no attention on retail, no attention on the real places where jobs are growing again, with this essentially inability to get other types of manufacturing.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, and let's just start there for a second, because we sort of identified that as a strength, really from the perspective of juicing the tax incentives, because it may be an odd kind of strength, but from the perspective of transitioning from one kind of energy community to another, right? That's why we were thinking about it that way. It's fairly damn easy if you're in, you know, West Virginia to think about the coal community, and that to some extent is a broader part of Southwest Pennsylvania region. But we were thinking more from the juicing of the tax incentives. And I don't want, I mean, some of the sort of questions, and then Brian will sort of tell us where to start, really do get to the, I think, this issue of a legacy system, really, a sort of state rules and practices and investments, which sort of reflect, in some ways, that, you know, an economy that was sort of created from, you know, 1980, you know, to the early part, you know, 2010, let's say. We're now like in some kind of different world here, where that 30 or 40 year kind of economic evolution is now being upheaved. It's very easy if you're in Michigan to understand what that does in some ways, because Michigan is so dominated by the auto sector, and they so rapidly need to shift from industrial combustion factories to EV factories. But what that's enabled Michigan to think through at the highest level politically and from a business sector is, let's play out the supply chain of the new EV industry in the United States and in Canada, et cetera. And let's try to see if we can dominate every bit of it, right? I think for states that have more diverse economies, that haven't had that central organizing kind of industrial cluster, it's harder to get your head around all this, right? So I do think that some of these other places just have an easier go of it, because, you know, they are more easily defined, you know, by these dominant industrial clusters. Brian, order out of chaos. What should we start with?
Yeah, why don't we start with some of the big picture questions?
Okay.
Just about how do we get everything organized? First, I want to go to the earliest round of questions that were asked, around the sort of organizing, connecting rural areas and metros. Do you feel like you got to that enough, Bruce? I know you highlighted that as a good area of interest.
Yeah, I do think that one thing just to think about, which is an odd thing in the US, is the way we define metropolitan areas is by commuting standards, commuting patterns. And therefore, about half of rural America actually lives in metropolitan areas as designated by the federal government. So as we think about cities, older suburbs, newer suburbs, exurbs, and rural, there is a sort of combined organic economy here, of labor markets and, you know, energy and housing, et cetera. So if we're smart at the metropolitan scale, ipso facto, we should be able to sort of to address some of the rural questions. Then we move into non-metropolitan America. The way states like New York have organized themselves is they've organized themselves as regions, 10 regions in New York, which then pick up these non-metro areas and then think through sort of supply chains and, you know, spillover effects and all the rest of it. There is a notion that Pennsylvania should organize that way, by the way. Brookings put out a report on innovation in Pennsylvania, and one of the recommendations was to basically take the New York State, you know, regional competitiveness program and apply it to Pennsylvania. California is doing this, Indiana is doing this. So I do think there's a way of organizing a lot of this at a metropolitan / regional scale, and then connecting the dots across some of these questions around industry and talent. And but I do think that the state is going to have to do a heavy lift on some of the capacity issues, because the federal government really is putting out all this money without building capacity. They're just assuming the country knows how to do this. And going to Rob's question, after losing muscle memory, after 40 years of globalization and a whole bunch of other structural trends. So there besides just organizing at a bigger scale and connecting the dots, there's going to have to be a capacity surge here. Not every little town or municipality by itself, but some kind of collective, advisory and implementation effort, or else a whole bunch of places are going to get bypassed.
Yeah, Mike, can I add to that? Can I put a little finer point on that?
Yeah.
Maybe corner Lori a little bit. The benefits are getting richer. The deal structure is going to get a lot more complex, right? So as Lori, I'm remembering your one slide where a project could layer up to 70% of its costs in tax credits. Those are highly likely to be non-urban projects in my estimation. But the sophistication of that deal structure really resides with some of the crazy bone-crushing developers who've been, trying to layer historic tax credits with new market tax credits and setting up ownership structure. So I do think the capacity issue is huge for us, and it really plays out as soon as you get outside of the SPCs and the URAs and the Allegheny County and the city of Pittsburgh and the Port Authority, folks who are dedicated, targeted, looking at these things. We jump out to a great developer with a great site and a municipality that wants to see something happen. And then there's all this other, how do we move this stuff forward? So do you think my assumption there, Lori, right, is that some of the greatest leveraged projects might be outside of the urban core? That might be my one question. Like there's real benefits to be had there.
You know, the only way you get to 70% is with affordable housing development, and it's absolutely the folks who know how to use LIHTC and new markets. But I'm not sure it's going to take getting to 70% to make this magic happen. Right now, renewables are at 26%, and you've got a bunch of states where there's a lot of renewable development happening at 30%. So even, I mean, at 26%, because the credits have been going down and it's supposed to expire next year, this extends it another 10 years and adds more technologies that might be more suitable. For example, we learned in Detroit that it's not a great place for solar. It's just not intense enough. It has to be, battery storage or geothermal, right? So first of all, the renewable sources are expanded that might work in more places that haven't worked before. Second of all, I don't know. I mean, you need to talk to a solar developer. I'm not a project developer, but if 30% was good enough for some of these places, wouldn't 50% or 60%? You've got low-income communities. I think the energy community and the affordable housing development are going to be the toughest parts here. So that gets you to 50%. And that comes down to, how are we marketing this? How are we attracting project developers to a state where, we've talked to developers who said, oh, I've been dying to come into Pennsylvania, but, we sat in those state committee meetings and, no one seemed to ever want to talk to us or think about a renewable portfolio standard. So I think there needs to be not only marketing to users, but to the renewable industry to come in, if not to generate your own industry. Carnegie Mellon, I'm sure, with a variety of its engineering programs, is graduating talent that's going potentially elsewhere into the renewable industry. How do we keep them? I don't know if that answered.
No, it does. It does. It's, as I see what you've presented there, there's a huge opportunity for rural southwestern Pennsylvania to get to the closing on deals that heretofore have been impossible to get to. It's the team of people that need to make this happen. I'm kind of putting a finer point on Bruce's capacity question. Yeah.
A lot of these questions, Rob, really go to this sort of new kind of capital stacking. that has to play out. And I mean, look, this just tells you how old I am. I remember when LIHTC was passed, low income housing tax credit was passed in '86. And, you know, Lori and I worked on the banking committee in the Senate. And what began in '87 through, let's say, 90, 91 was a whole bunch of early machinations about, you know, and this is in a positive way, financial engineering of that tax incentive, right? Communication about it, the building of a whole new network of nonprofit, remember enterprise list, they were really, you know, sort of growing at that stage, along with the banks, along with philanthropies. That was one tax incentive, right? We got multiples here, right? And I think what we're going to have to think through in sort of our large metropolitan areas and then across multiple areas are these sort of capital stack, project finance, advisory services, so we can maximize all this. Everyone's now just absorbing what just happened. And as you could tell from Lori's presentation, it's remarkable when you know, the stacking of, you know, different sort of policy choices and how that affects the value of incentives. Everyone's just still absorbing this stuff. But we're not going to wait 5 years, as you know, to basically create a, you know, a market for this stuff. We're going to have to do this in real time. So I think this is where I do think certain places can lead the parade. You know?
We have some participants on the webinar here from Reimagine Appalachia. Their ideas were marketed and included in the IRA. Like they've been at this for a very long time. They have a really nice network of folks who are talking about the important issues. And so luckily we have a platform to maybe start to talk about what some of these next more transactional issues might mean and might look like. And they're on a consistent schedule of really important webinars. So Amanda and Steve and everybody, more to come on this front. Brian, you wanna take us to the next issue?
Yeah, sure. I think folding into your, I think, sense of urgency that's coming through this call, there are a couple of questions about sort of who does this. One of them, Pittsburgh specific, so maybe you have some insight, Rob, but, you know, very specifically, like, what is the role of CDCs and nonprofits that work with distressed communities on the one hand, and then thinking about tax credits, especially, you know, who in Pittsburgh are the people or organizations that could be helpful here? You know, the Green Building Alliance was mentioned, but I think people are trying to get a sense of who do we look to and who plays which roles.
Brian, I think I might, because Drexel's in Philadelphia, I might try to extend out, you know, because we have an energy authority in Philadelphia that was created by our city council whenever, a decade ago or something. It might be helpful to think about what might be either the same set of actors in our two cities or potentially complementary actors. What Pennsylvania has writ large compared to a lot of other states is a network of the Ben Franklins on the technology side, CDFIs, and some of these other NGO networks, either focused on housing or focused, you know, on some of the early energy transition. Getting that connected quick, because we've talked to the Philly Energy Authority multiple times. I think they would be quite, you know, open to this. And then that could then, you know, be a sort of a feedback loop, you know, to the state with the new administration. But I think, you know, the Green Building Alliance, and so I think what probably makes sense is to really think about these sectors that have been identified and sort of targeted with the tax incentives, and then think about, okay, where do you have folks that really do have some chops in this, and where do you really need to fill in because of, you know, loss of muscle memory and all the rest. I mean, that kind of analysis, I think, with Philly and Pittsburgh to start, I'm not going to leave out the rest, you know, but might be a helpful. Philly is a city county, so we don't, you know, we're combined on the eastern side of the state, whereas you've got also Allegheny, and that would be an interesting sort of matchup. So it's not just city to city, it's city/county to, you know, compare.
Yeah.
I will say one of the benefits of getting stuff done, even in an era of restrained cash, has been the innovation that has happened, right? The great CDC is the CDC that really doesn't do the deal anymore. It
Yeah,
sets up the vision, it
yeah,
lands the developer who can land the tax credit and negotiates the benefit. The ones who have to do the deal struggle because it's not a subsidy environment. It's really kind of a tax credit environment. Our regional industrial development corporation, who has figured out how to do incredible stuff with very little, is now being asked by a lot of these adjoining municipalities to, hey, can you come and check out our site? And what would you do here? And now in this kind of different funding environment, what could they do? And it's those implementers who have been struggling in resource constrainment that know all the restrictions of the state that are stopping more solar from happening. It's interesting. We're well poised. The question is, can we get out of the skeptical mode and into an optimistic one, especially when the future of a lot of this rests with the IRS and the Treasury. It's interesting.
Yeah. Bruce, speaking of, Pittsburgh specifically, Bruce, there was a question about Pittsburgh's financial sector and the role that you think it could play here. If you had given any thoughts to that.
I think this is a really interesting question. So I have to think about how to answer it. There are certain parts of the United States, I would include Philly actually, that have large concentration of wealth management, which affect the equity and the investor side of the equation, which fits to some of this, right? Most parts of the US, I think, have large, banks, regional banks, and some CDFIs. The question, I think, for the capital equation is, we're going to go through a transition here, right? We're going to go through a transition where we need to rethink the stacking of particular capital stacking of particular projects, the blending and braiding of incentives. And then we're going to have to think about products themselves. And so I think what we have is a financial sector which is about to get disrupted, frankly, because we've got a lot of legacy products. What we have found when dealing on the procurement side, particularly if you're a Black or brown-owned business, you don't really get to the banks and the CDFIs. You deal with fintech. You're financing a lot of your stuff with credit cards. There's no real tradition of letter of credits as you're dealing either in the construction space or other space. So I think we have a lot of institutions and intermediaries that are probably, with the Small Business Credit Initiative and with this fire hose of tax incentives, are going to be stressed, I guess, to sort of upgrade their game and think about what are, new kinds of products and new ways for small and medium-sized enterprises to navigate those products. So I didn't regard it as a strength, because I think, and it's not a knock on Pittsburgh. I think it's just a sort of a observation about financial sector writ large. It's going to need to change if we're going to make these transitions. Lori.
Yeah, I might have missed it, Bruce, but we didn't really speak in our presentation about the 27 billion for green banks. And that funding goes to nonprofit lending institutions or to states. to give out to whomever will come to, up to speed to become a green bank. And I think, the best that we should start thinking about is how to have the existing green banks around the country serve as technical advisors to nascent ones, or, how to have certain nonprofit spinoffs of financial institutions that already know how to do this, do it in the name of, helping communities and smaller businesses upscale and get access to this capital, because I'm not sure it's going to work. It's going to be just the kind of debt capital or the traditional venture capital for startups, or even the revenue-based capital. I think it's going to have to incorporate tax credits, and so it's going to be a mix.
Yeah, so we're getting to time here, and I want to just say, for all these questions, we will, if there's a way to get to people's emails, we will try to respond to the questions. You're not surprisingly, the questions cover a lot of different kinds of sectors and a lot of different kinds of, financial and other, issues. So it's apples, oranges, and bananas out there. I mean, if you've ever seen the Hitchcock film, The 39 Steps, it's like it's, we are not an expert in everything, but we do have a lot of relationships to folks who are experts. At NOAC Lab in Drexel, we put out an innovative finance playbook. So there's a lot of material that we've put together with colleagues that relate to some of these questions, and we've got to make sure that we get those to everyone.
Let me just talk about some next steps. I can't believe there's still 78 folks on this. I appreciate everybody who's hung with us. We're going to get the presentation out to folks, some kind of downloadable link. We'll figure that out. We're going to have the recording here posted on Heinz's YouTube channel. We'll give you guys a link to that. And then, Bruce, if you and your team wouldn't mind maybe finishing out the answers to these questions, we'll try to get those in some kind of Word document and out to everybody. That's a next step I think we can commit to there. If you're cool with that. On behalf of me and my team, I just want to thank you guys, Lori, Florian, Bruce, Brian, really super stuff, and provocative and hard to digest and exciting. A real opportunity in front of us if we can figure out the right next steps. And there's the participants on this call are the right first steps there. We just got to figure out how to harness that energy. I'll give you a last word, Bruce, if you want it.
Well, just thank you and Andrew for hosting this, and thanks to everyone for participating. We're in some kind of group therapy session here, I suppose. So we're all going to learn a lot together as our country restructures our economy for hopefully a much better, prosperous, inclusive, and sustainable future. So we're along for the ride, and we will answer this and get all the material out. And it's just been great to just prepare for this in many respects. So thank you.
All right. With that, I want to wish everybody a great Groundhog's Day, and we'll be in touch. Thank you so much.
Bye.